The stone corridor beneath the Colosseum runs cold even in summer. Down here, where the torch smoke clings to the ceiling like guilty secrets, the air tastes of copper and fear. It's the year 89 AD, and above your head, 50,000 Roman citizens are screaming for blood. But it's not the roar of the crowd that should terrify you. It's the silence that comes after, when the gates close, when the sand drinks its fill, and when the victors return to the cells below. Because what happened in those subterranean chambers, in the ludus schools, and the holding pens scattered across the empire, was never written in marble or celebrated in verse. Some horrors are too deliberate to memorialize. Some truths rot in the dark. This is the story of those truths, and I promise you, it's worse than you think. Before we descend further into this darkness, if you crave more untold histories, more secrets excavated from the forgotten corners of the past, follow this channel. Because some stories don't just teach us about history, they teach us about the depths of human nature, and those lessons never get old. Let's begin with what you think you know. The gladiator, that bronze-skinned warrior carved from marble and mythology, fighting for glory beneath the Mediterranean sun. We've been sold this image for centuries. The noble savage, the honored warrior, the man who could win his freedom with a sword and enough courage. Hollywood gave him a square jaw and a hero's journey. History gave him a name, a legacy, a place in the pantheon of Roman virtue. But history is written by those who can afford the marble. The Colosseum, the Flavian amphitheater as it was known then, stood as a monument to Roman power, rising 157 feet above the city's heart. Emperor Vespasian ordered its construction in 72 AD, built on the drained lake of Nero's Golden House, a symbolic reclamation of public space from imperial excess. Completed under his son Titus in 80 AD, it could hold up to 50,000 spectators who entered through numbered archways, their tickets, or rather their tessera, determining their place in the social hierarchy that the very architecture enforced. The senators sat closest to the blood. The plebeians climbed higher. But beneath the travertine limestone and the marble columns, beneath the arena floor with its elaborate system of trapdoors and mechanical hoists, there existed another world entirely. The hypogeum, a two-level subterranean network of tunnels and chambers stretching across an area of 6 acres. Here, in the perpetual twilight, gladiators waited in cells barely large enough to lie down in. Here, exotic beasts paced in iron cages, their roars muffled by earth and stone. And here, in the forgotten corners that even our archaeological digs have struggled to fully map, women waited too, not for glory, not for freedom, for something far worse. Her name was Sabina, though that detail survives only in a single piece of graffiti scratched into the wall of a gladiatorial barracks in Pompeii, preserved by the same volcanic ash that killed her. Sabina was here, it reads in crude Latin. The gods have no mercy. She was right about that. To understand what happened to women like Sabina, you must first understand the ludus, the gladiatorial training schools that dotted the Roman Empire like infected wounds. The largest and most infamous was the ludus magnus in Rome, connected to the Colosseum by an underground tunnel so that fighters could be delivered directly to slaughter without ever seeing daylight. Built under the Emperor Domitian between 81 and 96 AD, it could house and train up to 3,000 gladiators at its peak. But the ludus was more than a school. It was a prison, a business, and a laboratory for human degradation. The lanistae, the trainers and owners of gladiators, operated under imperial license but with remarkable autonomy. These were businessmen first, many of them former gladiators themselves who had survived long enough to buy their way out of the arena. They understood the economics of violence. A well-trained gladiator represented years of investment in food, medical care, training, and equipment. A dead gladiator was expensive. A traumatized, broken gladiator was useless. So they developed techniques, methods, systems of control, and women were central to these systems. The historical record speaks cautiously of this reality, hidden behind euphemism and scholarly distance. Ancient sources mention camp followers and women of negotiable affection who attached themselves to gladiatorial troops. Juvenal, the Roman satirist writing around 100 AD, mocked aristocratic women for their sexual obsession with gladiators, describing how senators' wives would abandon their husbands to follow these fighters, seduced by the masculine brutality of the arena. But Juvenal was writing satire for the upper classes. He wasn't documenting the ludus. He wasn't describing what happened in those cells. The women in the gladiatorial schools weren't there by choice. They were slaves, captured in Rome's endless wars of expansion, sold at markets from Britannia to Syria, or born into servitude within the empire itself. Some were criminals, their sentences commuted to something the law considered more merciful than execution. Some were simply unlucky, in the wrong place when the wrong man needed property. The ludus required them, not for pleasure, though that was certainly extracted, but for control. Picture the morning routine at the Ludus Magnus. The sun hasn't yet burned the mist from the Tiber, but the gladiators are already awake. They've been woken before dawn by the lorari, the whip men who enforce discipline, and herded into the central courtyard where the training posts wait. These are men who might die today, tomorrow, next week. Men whose bodies are weapons and whose lives are measured in crowd applause. They are fed first. A thick barley porridge the fighters called gladiatoribus sagina, gladiator gruel. It's deliberate, this diet. Barley creates subcutaneous fat, a layer of protection that makes wounds look more dramatic while protecting the muscle beneath. Good for spectacle, good for business. But food is only part of the control mechanism. Sexual release, the Lannister understood, affected a fighter's aggression. Too much, and a gladiator became soft, distracted, his edge dulled by satisfaction. Too little, and he became unpredictable, dangerous to trainers and fellow fighters alike, his frustration boiling into violence at the wrong moments. So they calibrated it, engineered it. The women kept in the ludus served this purpose. They weren't prostitutes in any economic sense. They received nothing, owned nothing, chose nothing. They were instruments of psychological manipulation, human tools in the business of manufacturing killers. The system worked like this. After successful training sessions or victories in the arena, certain gladiators were granted access to the women's cells. This wasn't secret or shameful. It was policy, discussed openly in the surviving accounts of ludus management. The access was brief, supervised, and strategic. It became something to fight for, a reward to dangle, a privilege to revoke. And for the women, it was an existence that defied the very concept of humanity. Ancient graffiti from Pompeii's gladiatorial barracks provides our most direct window into this horror. One inscription, scratched by a woman's hand, the letters uneven, suggesting limited literacy or great haste, reads, "Here I served 37 before the moon changed." Another, more chilling, "They call us lucky because we don't die in the sand." The women lived in separate cells, often adjacent to the gladiators' quarters, but separated by iron bars and locked doors. They saw their captors constantly, but could reach them only when the doors opened. The psychological torture of this arrangement cannot be overstated. Proximity without protection, visibility without hope. Not all gladiators were created equal, and this hierarchy extended to their access to the women. At the top stood the rudiari, fighters who had earned their freedom but continued to fight for profit. These men had proven themselves in the arena, survived long enough to buy their way out of slavery, and now fought as free agents commanding enormous fees. They had the most status, the most money, and functionally unlimited access to whatever the ludus could provide. Below them, the primi palus, the champions of their particular fighting style. A Murmillo champion who had won his last 5 fights, or a Retiarius whose trident had spilled senatorial blood for the mob's entertainment. These men were celebrities within the ludus, their victories ensuring the Lannista's reputation and wealth. Then came the Secundi Palace and Terry Palace, the ranked fighters who showed promise, who might become champions if they lived long enough. And at the bottom, the novitius, the novices, the newly enslaved, the untested and untrained who would likely die in their first real combat. This hierarchy determined everything, including access to the women. The champions chose first. They might spend an entire night, might request specific women, might demand privacy or an audience of other gladiators forced to watch. These requests were accommodated because happy champions won fights, and winning fights made everyone rich. The ranked fighters received access on a schedule, their rewards calibrated to their performance. Win, and you received a visit. Lose but survive, and you waited. Die, and the lanista recycled your equipment to someone more useful. The novices received nothing until they proved their worth. This created a vicious motivation. Survive the arena, climb the ranks, gain access to one of the few pleasures available in this hell. The system turned victims into predators, then rewarded them for the transformation. And the women? They existed at the mercy of this entire grotesque hierarchy, their suffering multiplying with each level, each fighter, each night. The physical reality of this system was medically documented, though Roman physicians wrote about it with the casual distance of scientists observing animals. Galen of Pergamon, who served as physician to gladiators in the 150s AD, noted in his medical texts the high rates of what he termed womb sickness among women kept in gladiatorial establishments. He prescribed various herbal treatments, pennyroyal, silphium, rue, without ever questioning the source of the condition. These women became pregnant constantly. The laniste viewed this as a management problem, not a moral one. Pregnant women were temporarily useless for their primary function, and childbirth in the ancient world carried staggering mortality rates. Perhaps 1 in 50 births resulted in the mother's death. The solutions were brutal and practical. Forced abortions using the herbs Galen mentioned, or more violent physical methods. Some women were simply sold off when they became pregnant, their burden transferred to new owners. The children born in the ludus, and there were many, faced predetermined fates. Boys might be raised as future gladiators, girls as future instruments of control. A mercy killing was sometimes considered the kindest option. The spread of disease within these conditions was inevitable. In the close quarters of the hypogeum and ludus, where hundreds of bodies were pressed together in spaces designed for neither comfort nor hygiene, infections flourished. Roman medicine understood disease poorly. Their theory of miasma blamed bad air rather than transmission through contact, so no systematic precautions existed. Women suffered disproportionately. The infections that resulted from repeated sexual violence, from unhygienic conditions, from the constant physical trauma, had no effective treatment in the ancient world. Many simply died, their bodies disposed of in the mass graves outside city walls, where slaves and criminals were buried without ceremony. The survivors were those who developed immunity through sheer biological chance, or those whose spirits broke so completely that they stopped resisting, stopped feeling, stopped being recognizably human in any way that mattered. But here's where the story twists into even darker territory. The women in the ludus weren't all slaves. Some, a smaller but significant number, were Roman citizens of birth, patrician women who had committed the unforgivable crime of choosing their own desires. Roman law in the 1st and 2nd centuries AD was explicit about female sexuality. It belonged to fathers, then husbands, then sons. A woman's body was property, her chastity the coin that bought family alliances and political power. When aristocratic women engaged in affairs, particularly with gladiators, they violated not just moral codes, but property law. The punishment was transformation into property themselves. Senatorial decrees from this period show the panic such relationships caused among the elite. The Senatus Consultum Claudianum of 52 AD specifically addressed women of high birth who chose relationships with slaves. The law declared that such women could be enslaved themselves, their property seized, their children illegitimate. But written law and its application were different things. A woman caught with a gladiator lover might be legally enslaved, but sending her to the mines or fields would be too public, too scandalous. Families wanted these embarrassments erased, not advertised. So they made arrangements with the lanistae. The disgraced patrician woman would disappear. Officially, she might be said to have died in childbirth, or retired to a remote villa, or joined a religious cult. In reality, she was transferred quietly to a ludus, often one far from Rome. Her identity was stripped along with her freedom. She became just another body in the cells, her aristocratic education, and bearing just another source of entertainment for the men who used her. Juvenal mocked these women in his satires, but he had it backwards. These weren't women chasing gladiators despite their status. These were women punished for transgressing their status, fed to the very system they dared to approach as equals. The irony was vicious. Patrician women who romanticized gladiators for their masculine freedom ended up as gladiatorial property, discovering exactly what that freedom cost. In 73 BC, Spartacus led the most famous gladiatorial revolt in history. He and 78 other fighters escaped from the ludus in Capua, eventually raising an army of 70,000 slaves and ravaging Italy for 2 years. Every schoolchild knows this story. But here's what they don't teach. What happened to the women in the ludus during the rebellion? When Spartacus broke out, the women initially saw liberation. Some of the escaped gladiators brought them along, either out of genuine compassion or simple lust. These women became part of the rebel camp, following the army through its campaigns across southern Italy. But revolution doesn't erase what it's built upon. The patterns of the ludus replicated themselves in the rebel camps. The strongest fighters claimed women as prizes. Hierarchies reformed. Rape culture, it turns out, isn't something you leave behind when you break your chains. It's something that has to be consciously dismantled, and desperate men running for their lives rarely have the philosophical clarity for that work. When Crassus finally crushed the rebellion in 71 BC, the 6,000 survivors were crucified along the Appian Way, their crosses stretching for miles. The historical record focuses on these men, on their courage and their suffering. The women who were recaptured aren't mentioned at all. They simply vanished back into the system, returned to the ludus as damaged property. Their brief taste of freedom made their return to captivity all the more crushing. Some, according to fragmentary accounts, chose death, throwing themselves from cliffs or onto soldiers' swords rather than return to the cells. No monument marks their suffering. No historian recorded their names. Galen's clinical observations provide our most detailed medical understanding of what these women endured, though his detachment is itself a form of horror. He noted that women in gladiatorial establishments had a life expectancy roughly 15 years shorter than comparable female slaves in household service. He documented the prevalence of pelvic injuries, internal scarring, and chronic pain. He observed that many became infertile after several years, their bodies simply giving up on reproduction as a biological defense mechanism. He wrote all this down with the same neutral tone he used to describe battlefield wounds and athletic injuries. Galen also noted psychological symptoms, though he lacked the vocabulary to properly describe them. Women who would stare at nothing, who spoke without sense, who became violent toward themselves or refused food until death. We would recognize these symptoms today as severe trauma, dissociation, and suicidality. Galen called it corruption of the female humors and recommended bloodletting. The treatments available for physical injuries were primitive at best. Infected wounds were treated with wine, vinegar, or honey. Internal injuries had no treatment at all. Women simply lived with the pain until they couldn't anymore. Childbirth complications killed routinely, and the forceful abortion methods caused permanent damage to reproductive organs. Many women didn't survive long enough for these chronic conditions to fully develop. They died quickly, from disease, from botched abortions, from infections, from simple violence when they became more trouble than they were worth. Perhaps most disturbing is how Roman culture processed this reality. They knew. Everyone knew. It wasn't a secret hidden in the dark. It was policy implemented in plain sight. Yet the cultural mythology around gladiators remained heroic. They were celebrated in mosaics, praised in poetry, fantasized about by aristocratic women who should have known better. The contrast between public image and private reality was itself a form of violence, a collective delusion that allowed the horror to continue. The Roman moral philosophy of the time justified this through elaborate logical gymnastics. Stoicism, the dominant philosophy among educated Romans, emphasized virtue, self-control, and accepting one's place in the natural order. Slaves were slaves by nature, according to prevailing thought. Women were inherently inferior to men. Therefore, what happened in the ludus was simply the strong exercising their natural dominion over the weak. Even early Christianity, which would eventually condemn the games as barbaric, struggled to address this specific atrocity. The Church Fathers railed against the violence of the arena, but said remarkably little about the sexual violence beneath it. Women's suffering, it seemed, was so normalized as to be invisible even to reformers. The gladiatorial games began to decline in the 4th century AD as Christianity gained political power. Emperor Constantine banned gladiatorial games in 325 AD, though the law was widely ignored. The last recorded gladiatorial fight occurred in 435 AD, more than a century after the official prohibition. But the ludus system survived even longer. The training schools, stripped of their primary purpose, transformed into military training facilities, private militias, and, in some cases, simply prisons. The women trapped within them weren't freed by Christianity's triumph. They were just reclassified as different kinds of slaves serving different kinds of masters. The Colosseum itself, that great monument to Roman engineering and Roman bloodlust, fell slowly into disrepair. Earthquakes damaged it. Looters stripped its marble and bronze. It became a quarry, its stones recycled into churches and palaces across Rome. But the hypogeum remained, buried and forgotten for centuries. When archaeologists finally excavated it in the 19th and 20th centuries, they found evidence of its use. The pulley systems, the animal cages, the holding cells. They found graffiti, some of it clearly written by women. They found small personal items, combs, cheap jewelry, fragments of cloth. They found the outlines of a system designed to break human beings. Stand today in the ruins of the Colosseum, and you'll see tourists taking selfies, guided tours discussing architectural innovations, souvenir vendors selling plastic swords. The building has been sanitized, transformed into a symbol of Roman achievement rather than Roman atrocity. But beneath your feet, in those restored and carefully lit hypogeum chambers, thousands of women lived and died in conditions we can barely fathom. Their names are lost. Their stories weren't recorded. Their suffering was so normalized that it barely rated mention in contemporary accounts. This is the most horrifying part. We don't know the full scope of what happened down there. We have fragments, implications, archaeological evidence of general conditions, but the specific details, the individual stories, the personal horrors, the moments of despair and defiance are gone. Deliberately erased or simply forgotten because women's pain has never been considered historically significant enough to preserve. The Roman Empire lasted over 1,000 years if you count both its Western and Eastern incarnations. The gladiatorial system operated for roughly 600 years. Multiple millions of gladiators passed through the ludus system during that time. And supporting them, feeding the machinery of violence with their bodies and their suffering, were women whose numbers we cannot even estimate. They were captive to an empire that viewed them as objects. They were captive to a system that used them as tools. They were captive to men who had themselves been made into weapons. And they were captive to a historical memory that has been so thoroughly scrubbed of their presence that we can barely reconstruct their existence. The Colosseum still stands as a monument to human achievement. But perhaps it should stand as a monument to something else, to the countless invisible victims of every grand civilization, to the suffering hidden beneath every great empire's glory, To the women whose names we'll never know and whose pain we can never fully comprehend. Because when we celebrate Roman architecture and Roman law, when we study Latin and admire their engineering, we should remember that all of it, every marble column, every aqueduct, every road, was built on a foundation of human misery so vast that we're still uncovering its dimensions 2 millennia later. The gladiators fought and died in the sun, and history remembered them. The women suffered and died in the dark, and history forgot them entirely, till now. The torch gutters in the stone corridor. The crowd above...